Kristiansand is a seaside resort on the Norwegian Riviera. Kristiansund is a harbour town deep in the western fjords. Just one letter and over 1,000 kilometres of scenery separate them as I travel around the coast from Sund to Sand over land. I'm starting my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand, naturally in Oslo. I landed in Norway late the previous evening at Oslo, and after an overnight stop at the airport, I'm arriving into Kristiansund on the morning flight. Though there's not much to see, as a thick layer of cloud obscures what should be a very pretty landing into the city's airport. Spread out over 3 islands, Kirklandet, Innlandet and Nordlandet, the city of Kristiansund has one of the highest population densities in Norway, with a total land mass of just 8.45 square kilometres and a population of more than 18,000 people. Before the introduction of postal codes in Norway in 1968, there was so much misdirection of mail between the two almost identically named cities that it was obligatory to add an N for Nord after Kristiansund and an S for Sur after Kristiansand in addresses to avoid misdirection, and in some instances the town is still referred to as Kristiansund N. The city is defined by the strait, or sund, that is formed by the 3 islands creating a large natural harbour hidden from the sea, which is why the old name for the town was Fosna, or Fossen, which means hiding place or hidden port. It wasn't until 1742 that the town was renamed after Danish-Norwegian king Christian VI. The Sund is likely to have attracted some of the earliest settlers to the area around 10,000 years ago, being ice-free and abundant in seafood. However, it wasn't until the Middle Ages that a small fishing harbour grew up around Fossen, and not until the 17th century that it grew into any form of settlement. As the town grew in size, the government established a customs station here, a substation of the main trading port in Trondheim. With the water being so important to Kristiansund, it's unsurprising that it was very early into having a motor ferry to shuttle between the islands. The Sundbåt, literally straight boat, is a small shuttle boat that zigzags across the strait on a roughly half-hourly repeating service and has been operating continuously, except Sundays, since the 18th of November 1876. Today, the service shuttles between the main landing stage at Kirklandet in the historic centre of the town and landing points on Innlandet and the west side of Nordlandet before returning to Kirklandet and then heading out again to Melviken on the north side of Nordlandet and Gommelandet on the far side of Kirklandet before returning to Kirklandet to start the route all over again. Whilst these days the bridges and bus routes across the town mean that most people can access the other islands with ease, it's still a popular service, particularly with tourists and especially with, in 2025, it being free to use. Just by the main Sundbåt stop on the waterfront are a series of statues. The Klippfiskerne, or Clipfish woman, is the town's mascot and a tribute to the women who worked in the clipfish, dried salt cod industry in the town for over 300 years. Whilst opposite her is the Sildgutten, or Herring Boy, a statue marking the era when the harbour was bustling with small trawlers and little boys running around with herring hooks. In April 1940, German bombing of the city took out around 800 of the city's 1,300 buildings. Kristiansund by itself accounts for 28% of the total damage to buildings in Norway during World War II. Following the war, the reconstruction of the city was rapid, with 68% of the city having been rebuilt by 1950. The city is a cultural centre of Norway with a particular connection to opera, being home to the first opera house to open in the country in 1928 and the annual opera festival that's taken place every February since 1971. A short distance away from the main harbour and up the waters that create the isthmus that Gommelandet is on is the Mellemværftet, or Middle Yard, a historic shipyard and these days cultural monument that forms part of the Nordmøre Museum. First established in 1791, the shipyard was in continuous operation until 1978. It became a protected monument just 6 years later, in 1984. The shipyard has 3 slipways and a large workshop building built in half timber, half brick, dating from the latter part of the 19th century. The preserved shipyard also includes a sawmill, a materials shed, materials dock, and a tilting crane on the quayside. When the site was in full use, the shipyard owners lived in the residential building on the site, which dates from 1890, and in the 1900 census had 28 people living in it. In its heyday, the shipyard served the city's large fleet of small sailing ships, mainly used in the cod fisheries, collecting the raw ingredients for clipfish production. the yard both built and maintained for ships of the fleet. The western side of Kirklandet is home to some large open spaces all running into each other that makes it a pleasant area to go for a wander, starting with the Øverparken. Which along the formal planting is home to some monuments and a large fountain depicting a dolphin. Immediately behind Øverparken is the Kirklandet Kirke. The original church on this site was destroyed in the German bombing raids, and the current church, which was consecrated on the 24th of May 1964, after just 3 years of construction, is considered to be one of the first truly modern church buildings in the country. Across the church are 320 small windows that are all shades of red or yellow. From the rear of the Kirklandet Kirke, you're straight into the Vanndamman, one of the highest points of the island and a popular hiking area. The Vanndamman is a series of ponds that were previously used as a water supply for the city up until 1979, but is now a recreational area. Closest to the city is the Vanndamman or Swan Pond, the oldest of the ponds, and is today a haven for the city's ducks and swans. Around the outside of a fenced-off pond are a children's play park as well as a cafe, and in the centre of the pond is a water feature. Sitting above the Swan Pond at a higher level are the Mellemværftet and the Vesterdammen, or Middle Pond and West Pond. The two are at the same level and only separated by a small footpath that you can walk across to get views up and down the two ponds. Behind the West Pond is the Gravendam, or Grave Pond, which is separated from the West Pond by a much larger footpath sitting on top of a dam. At the rear of the Grave Pond, or perhaps in this instance Grave Dam is a better translation, is a pretty impressive dam wall that falls away down into the woods behind the pond and down towards the coast. As the city grew rapidly in the 19th century, the city began to develop a major problem with its water supply. The dam system was built using the topography of the hills around the Varden watchtower, using the hollows between the hills to collect and store rainwater that was funneled down into it from the surrounding area, and then dammed as the rear to create the ponds, which could then be used as a reservoir to supply the city's needs. As the needs of the city increased further, dams were added back up the slope to extend the ponds and expand the capacity, leading to the multiple ponds and the very large dam at the far end of the Gravendammen that exists to today. When the system was taken out of use as a public water supply, it was converted into a recreational area, with the gutter system used to feed the ponds turned into hiking trails. You can wander beyond the rear of the last pond and head out across the ridge of the hill until it comes to a natural end of the western side of the island and a view out across the Bremsnfjorden to the island of Odderøya. It's only once you're clear of the fjord that you reach the sea, which is why the strait at Kristiansand is so well hidden. Sitting above the ponds and above the gutters feeding all that water to them, at the highest point of the city is the old guard post and lookout tower, the Varden, or watchtower. The top of the hill is 78 metres above sea level, and from here there are excellent views out over the islands of Kristiansund and on a clear day out to the further outlying islands. A tower was first built here in 1801 and used as a guard station for the Northern Fjell optical telegraph. With this, messages could be sent to Trondheim long before radio communications became possible. The original wooden tower was replaced by a brick tower in 1892, but this was demolished in 1976 and rebuilt in 1983. The tower is open all year round, with a bell you can ring if the door is locked for the fire safety duty officer to remotely unlock it for you. Inside the tower, on the lower floor, are a series of murals. The staircase takes you up to the viewing platform on the top floor, from where there are even better views out over the fjords and beyond than from the ground level, along the telescope if you want to see further. For my next stop, as it was a Sunday and no boats were running, I opted to take the bus for 4 kilometres across Kirklandet, over the Overvangerbrua that clears the isthmus joining Kirklandet to Gommelandet, and then over the significantly more impressive Nordsundbrua that links Kirklandet and Gommelandet to Nordlandet. Before reaching my destination of the Kristiansundskiltet, the Hollywood-style sign hailing the town's name that's one of the most visible elements of the city as you enter the strait from the fjord. It's also a really good location for stunning views out over the natural harbour and both Kirklandet and Inlandet, particularly on a sunny day. From the Kristiansund sign, there's a pleasant 4 kilometre or so walk that you can take back over the Nordsundbrua to the north coast of Kirklandet to explore the coastline and its history. Starting at the beach at Lasken. Before heading up towards the northernmost point of the island, the ruins of a former World War II gun emplacement at Nordre Langehaugen. From here you have excellent views out of the whole of the north coast of the island and out into the open ocean, protecting both eastern and western approaches to the strait. Slightly further down the coast and you reach the Kystbatteri, or coastal battery. This is an even larger collection of gun emplacements and fortifications that lined the northern stretch of the island, all part of the Atlantic Wall, the massive fortifications built by the Nazis to try and turn Europe into an impenetrable fortress. Built between 1942 and 1944, the fortifications stretch from the very north of Norway all the way around its coast, down the western coast of Denmark and Germany, along the coast of the Netherlands and Belgium and the Atlantic coast of France, all the way to the Spanish border, as well as additional forts and bunkers on the occupied Channel Islands. At around 2,687 kilometres, or 1,670 miles long, most of the structures were built using forced labour. Today, the ruins of the fortifications dot the landscape of the Atlantic coast of Europe, from bunkers in Kirkenes all the way down to the fortifications in Hundai on the Spanish border. My tour of the north coast of Kirklandet brought me back into town past the church and down to my hotel where I was able to rest my weary feet ahead of moving on to the next destination the following morning. The next leg of my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand was a genteel 150-kilometre, just under 4-hour bus trip from Kristiansund down the coast to Ålesund, with the first part of the trip being to the ferry terminal in Mold. Cue the montage. After a 20 or so minute wait in the bus station in Mould, partly a comfort break, but also a comfortable bit of padding in the timetable to ensure the bus doesn't miss the ferry, the driver drives a short distance to the ferry terminal and on to the service across the Vestnes, which takes about 40 minutes. You can remain on the bus, or get out and stretch your legs on deck, or head down into the cafe for a coffee, and to my utter bewilderment, no waffles. They'd not had any delivered. I wasn't the only one shocked by the lack of a Norwegian staple. The ferry is crossing the Romsdalsfjord, the 9th longest fjord in Norway, with a distance of 88 kilometres or 55 miles. The ferry crosses the point where the fjord is at its deepest, of 550 metres or 1,800 feet. I don't think there's any risk of the ferry grounding on this route. This is also about the widest point of the fjord at nearly 12 kilometres or 7.5 miles wide, and the lengthy break of the crossing means the driver is good to go all the way through to Ålesund without needing to change. So as soon as we get the green light to disembark the ferry, cue the next montage. After arriving in Ålesund and dropping off bags in a hotel, I picked up a bus and headed out to the very western edge of the city at Sævollen. Much like Kristiansund, Ålesund is spread out over 3 islands, with the centre of Hesse wrapping around Hasseløy and the western end of Odderøya to create another large natural harbour. Hesse is the westernmost of the 3 islands, and Sævollen is the westernmost bus stop on the island. The island is dominated by the 314-metre tall Sukkertoppen, which sits in the middle of the island with just a narrow strip of land for south and west, which creates an almost perfect location for a coastal path and a pleasant, if you ignore the odd hefty shower passing through, walk. The walk takes you around the coastline between the almost sheer cliff sides of Sukkertoppen, with views out to the outlying islands. From the coastal path there are views out across the Bergen towards the islands of Godøy and Haraldshaugen, as well as the smaller islands further out into the North Atlantic itself. You can take a path down to the water's edge and out onto the ruins of a former gun emplacement to get better views out across the fjord, including, if you time it right, watching one of the many cruise ships that call on Ålesund each day departing. There are also excellent views back to Sukkertoppen, which by this point has gone from a wall of rock to doing a very good impersonation of a chunk of Toblerone. A little further along the coast and heading into the northwestern corner of Hesse, you reach Tueneset. Today the area is home to one of Northern Europe's largest saltwater aquariums, the Haraldshaugen, but 80 years ago it was the site of a major fortification on the Atlantic Wall. The Tueneset Kystbatteri consists of a large number of ruins, from basic foundations of buildings to major bunkers and even replica armaments from the day. On the bus ride back into the city centre, you cross the Steinvagbrua over the Steinvagsundet that joins Hesse to Hasseløy. From Ålesund, the next leg of my journey was to be the longest and perhaps the most brutal. Nearly 10 hours on the bus, including 3 ferry crossings for the 420 or so kilometres to Norway's second city, Bergen, though a big comfy seat at the front of the top deck certainly helped. From Ålesund, it was only a short drive of 50 minutes to the first ferry of the day, for the short 20-minute crossing of the Fjord from Svolvågen to Hasseløy, with the top deck of the bus proving to be the perfect viewing point for the short crossing. From Hasseløy, it was time to get properly comfortable for the 4.5 hour long and spectacular drive, including another ferry ride to the town of Sverd. Much like Mold on the journey between Kristiansund and Ålesund, Fort is a carefully timed rest stop. 45 minutes to the bus station to get out, stretch the legs, use the facilities, allow the driver to comply with driving time regulations, and make sure the bus is on time for the final push on the ferry from Larvik to Oppedal, and then on to Bergen. The Nordhollandsbrua marks the entrance into Bergen, crossing the Salhusfjorden and Osterfjorden, and pretty much marking the end of my journey for the evening. My stay in Bergen had been a fleeting overnight stop, and it was a morning Norway coach back out again heading south down the coast, with a genteel just 3 hours and one ferry to Haugesund. Haugesund is located within the Karmsund, a 30-kilometre long strait that separates the island of Karmøy from the mainland of Norway. The presence of the island helps to shelter Haugesund from some of the worst of the weather and turned the area into a strategically important location, as shipping could pass along the coast without having to sail through the heavy seas of the North Sea. The town itself is arranged around the mainland and two islands of Risøy and Hasseløy, creating an internal harbour and the waterfront area of the Smedsund. The town's initial growth was on the back of the herring industry, with huge numbers of the fish being present in the straits. Despite it only being a small unnamed fishing village, Haugesund has an important neighbour, as King Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway, lived at Avaldsnes, just south of modern-day Haugesund. The growth of Haugesund was slow, and it only achieved town status in 1855, separating from the surrounding municipality of Torvastad to become its own municipality. Over the following years, the city has absorbed many of the surrounding villages and towns to create the 72.69 square kilometre urban area that exists to today. Harald Fairhair reigned from 872 to 930, though there is academic debate as to whether he ever actually existed, as the only evidence is from Icelandic sagas from the 12th century onwards, but let's assume that he did. Harald was at the time the Viking leader of his own kingdom, and when they weren't raiding other countries, Viking kingdoms liked to fight each other. At some point around 872 on the Hafrsfjord, close to modern-day Stavanger, a major battle took place between multiple Viking kingdoms, the result of which was a victory for Harald, and with that the unification of the various Viking kingdoms into a single kingdom of Norway, with Harald as the first leader of the united nation. A side to this is that the leaders who had lost and didn't want to submit to Harald's rule emigrated to Iceland, kicking off the large-scale, by these times, settlement of that country. Today, a statue to Harald Fairhair, with his flowing locks looking like he's just stepped out of a shampoo commercial, stands on rocks high above the Smedsund. Harald lived to the age of 83, dying 3 years after relinquishing the throne to his favourite son, Eric Bloodaxe, and was buried in a mound at Hauga by the Strait of Karmsund, just north of the modern settlement of Haugesund. The modern town of Haugesund has grown up in a grid pattern stretching back up the hill from the water's edge, and close to the very centre of town is a reminder of its history, with the Fiskerne, or fisherman statue, the most significant statue in the town. Combined with a water feature, the statue occupies the street of the whole block, with the statue at the highest point of the street and the water feature cascading down the slope of the road. Behind the fisherman statue is the town's church, Vår Frelsers Kirke, or Our Saviour's Church. Historically, the people of Haugesund attended church for nearby Skorra Church, but with the establishment of Haugesund as its own municipality in 1855, a decision was taken to build a church for the town, with a suitable plot of land was quickly purchased in the centre of the town. However, it took another 35 years before permission was given by the government for a church to be built on the land in 1890. And it took another near 10 years before an architectural competition was held to design the church, with Einar Helleland being declared the winner in February 1899. From this point, the process sped up quite a bit, with construction of the church taking place between 1899 and 1901, and the consecration taking place on the 6th of March 1902, giving the townspeople a church of their own to attend, with a capacity of around 850 people. Today, the church is a parish church in the Diocese of Stavanger of the Church of Norway, the evangelical Lutheran denomination of Protestantism that is, by a long way, the largest religious group in the country. The church was built to a cruciform design in red bricks to a neo-Gothic style. An 11-metre high chandelier, which is designed to symbolise a huge royal crown, topped with 12 lamps, one for each of the apostles, was added in 1916. The spire of the church at 53 metres high is one of the most distinguishable items of a relatively low-rise Haugesund skyline. A short walk from the church is the town's very distinctive pink-painted City Hall, or Haugesund's Rådhus. The City Hall was built following the donation of 1 million Norwegian kroner to the council by shipping magnate Knut Knutsen and his wife Elizabeth in 1921 to celebrate Knut's 50th birthday. Today, the donation would be around 26 million kroner, or just under £2 million. By the 1920s, Knutsen was the largest steamship owner in Haugesund and one of the largest in Norway. A later donation provided funding for the park around the town hall, and in 1947, a year after her husband's death, Elizabeth gifted a further £1 million for works on decoration of a hall and gardens. After the initial donation, construction work started in 1923 and was completed by the autumn of 1931, though with a pause in works between 1925 and 1929 due to the growing international economic crisis of the 1920s that would ultimately lead to the Great Depression. The town hall has had its bright pink exterior colour since its construction, and in 2010 was named Norway's most beautiful town hall. Heading back towards the waterfront from the town hall, and you quickly come across one of the other stunning bits of architecture in the town, the Risøy Bridge, or Risøybrua, which crosses the Smedsund and connects the mainland to the smaller of the two islands of the town centre, Risøy. A sign on the bridge states that it was constructed in just 354 days with just 60 workers, with it opening to traffic on the 14th of May 1939. Since then, the bridge has undergone renovation works in 1991 and again in 2008. The bridge is 361 metres long and at its peak is 25.2 metres above the sea level, allowing passage for any ships suitable for sailing up the Smedsund. And because that's not that tall, Risøy is home to both the cruise terminal and the car ferries that serve the outlying islands of the city and region, with only local small catamaran services coming into the harbour on the mainland. Risøy is 0.23 square kilometres, with most of the western side of the island dominated by the docks, workshops and industrial halls belonging to Able, a Norwegian company specialising in the oil, gas and offshore wind industries. When industrial development began in earnest on the island in the 1930s, the population ballooned to around 3,000 residents, with most of the accommodation on the island being built on the eastern side, facing the centre of town. Since then, the population has fallen back down, and in 2014, the population of the island was just 527. At the northern end of the island, you get a good view across the Smedsund to the mainland, and directly opposite you, the southern coast of Hasseløy. If Risøy is connected to the mainland by the Risøybrua, then it's only natural that Hasseløy is connected to the mainland by the Hasseløybrua. This particular version of the bridge, opening in 1954, replaced an older bridge that had been built in 1872. At just 150 metres in length, it's less than half the length of Risøybrua and also quite a bit lower, reflecting the main route through the strait between the Hasseløy and Risøy, then a right turn past the mainland and Risøy, with only pleasure craft entering a small marina that sits between the mainland and Hasseløy. The current bridge does pose a slight problem for the island though, as weight restrictions on it means fire engines cannot carry their full complement of water if they need to get over to the island, only being allowed to cross with 6,000 of their 10,000 litre capacity tanks. Given that the island has many older wooden buildings, this is a potential problem. The island is slightly larger than Risøy at 0.3 square kilometres and has a population of around 1,500, substantially more than its neighbour. The north of the island is predominantly industrial, with a shipyard and workshops occupying the north coast, whilst the southwestern corner of the island is home to offices for the Norwegian Coast Guard that overlook the cruise port and the strait. From the west coast of the island there are views across to Vibrandsøy, a small group of islands, Trollholmen, Vibrandsøy, Varøy and Gardsøy, that are connected to each other by small bridges or causeways, but have no connection at all by land to either the mainland or Hasseløy. The islands were purchased by the municipality in 2009 and since then have been renovated and turned into a recreational area. A handful of passenger ferries from the ferry quay on the mainland make the short 5-minute crossing to the island each day. The eastern side of Hasseløy is dominated by the small boat harbour, as well as the herring museum, which was closed at the time of visiting. Heading further up the mainland, just beyond the northern tip of Hasseløy, you reach the start of the Kyststien, or coastal path, which runs for about 3 kilometres north away from the city centre. The path follows the coastline through its entire length and is a generally pretty easy path to walk, with a suitable diversion around the only truly hilly part for walk for those who don't want to, or can't, climb up over rocks. The coastal path includes a large section that takes you across grazing land, as well as past one of the main camping and caravanning grounds of the town. Along the way there are signboards that point out features in the landscape, wildlife to look out for, and also include maps showing where you are, though it's a very easy path to navigate. Towards the end of the path you can take a detour out along a spit of land to the Kvalen Fjord, or Kvalen Lighthouse. The lighthouse marks the entrance to the harbour of Haugesund and dates back to 1864. From here you can also look down into the small bathing area of Kvalsvik and the sculpture installation Rising Tide, originally located in the Thames in London, that's been here since 2021. The sculpture is made up of 4 horses, but their heads have been replaced with elements of oil wells or nodding donkeys. With each tide the sculptures are covered and then uncovered. A short walk back down the path and you can divert away again, this time to the Haraldshaugen, Norway's national monument. Unveiled in 1872 in connection for 1000th anniversary of the Battle of Hafrsfjord and Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway under his rule, the monument is placed where Harald's burial mound is once said to have stood. The mound is topped by a 17-metre high obelisk, and around the edge of the mound are 29 standing stones, one for each of the 29 ancient counties of Norway. The original plan was that each county would donate a stone of its own distinctive rock type, but even in a country as geologically varied as Norway, that wasn't possible to fully execute. With my time in Haugesund drawing to a close, it was time to hop back on the Norway Bus Express and head south to Stavanger. From the side of the Eskilstuna, it was just one short ride through the undersea by Fjordtunnelen before we reached Stavanger, and the penultimate stop on my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand. I've completed the penultimate leg of my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand and have arrived in Norway's oil capital. But Stavanger is no Dallas. Today, the third largest city in Norway and home to the oil and gas industry, up until the petrochemicals boom of the 1970s, the city of Stavanger was principally a town of fishing and shipping, in particular canning. In the 1950s, the town had over 50 canneries and was even called Norway's canned capital. The last factory closed in 2002, but by then the economy of the city had changed beyond all recognition, with more than half of all jobs in the city linked to the oil industry. The earliest traces of settlement in Stavanger are similar to those of Kristiansund. With the ice sheets retreating around 10,000 years ago, the fjords became a welcome place to settle, ice-free and abundant in seafood. The area would already have been a military and economic centre around the 9th century, as the Hafrsfjord, which sits just 3 kilometres southwest of the very centre of Stavanger, was the scene of the Battle of Hafrsfjord, which saw Harald Fairhair defeat the other Viking kings of the region to become the first king of Norway. The city was established in 1125, but likely had been growing for many years before that. Construction on the city's cathedral started around 1100 and was completed in 1125, which the city of Stavanger now counts as its official year of founding. The city had been an important religious centre, but with the Protestant Reformation in 1536, that role declined. Due to its general reliance on the fishing industry, the city's history is marked by almost constant swings between economic booms and recessions. By the early 1960s, the city population appeared to have reached a peak at around 50,000 and was already starting to decline, when the oil boom reversed the city's fortunes. By 2025, the population had passed the 150,000 mark, with around 10% of that population being made up of immigrants linked to the oil industry, primarily Poles, Brits and Turks. Unlike its Texan cousin, the city of Stavanger is still predominantly a low-rise, traditional wooden building city, with buildings lining the quayside as they wrap around the waters for harbours, nestled below Valberg, the hill that defines the centre of the city. The hill is topped by the Valbergtårnet, or Valberg Tower, built between 1850 and 1853, replacing an earlier wooden tower, as a lookout tower for the city's watchmen, vital in a city made up of so many wooden buildings. Fire alarm systems eventually made the role of a watchman redundant, but it wasn't until 1922 that the last watchman retired. 10 years after opening, the tower also gained a new role, as a lighthouse was installed within it. Since then, it's also served as a storm signal tower, maritime school, and the city's tourist office. Whilst the Valberg may look like a solid lump of rock in the heart of the city, it hides within itself a secret. Today, the hill is pretty much hollow, having been burrowed out to create a car park on multiple levels, including a lift that can get from harbourside to the top of the hill without all the effort of climbing. But what are those very heavy doors and the very wide steps down? Along with being a car park, the space can also double up as a shelter in the event of an emergency, with space for 5,430 people. The double-width stairwells allow for a fast flow of people into the top of the structure and down into the deeper levels of the bunker. The stairwell is also home to one of 23 iron men that form part of Broken Column, an art project by Anthony Gormley that saw 23 statues, all casts of the artist's body, dotted around the city from the top of the city's art museum to one placed partially submerged in a reef outside the harbour. The wide staircase leads you down to the lowest level of the car park, where many more heavy doors can seal the space off from the outside world, no matter what's going on. though it's then only a short walk through the car park itself and out into the sunlight of the roads at the base of the hill. From here, you're back into the area behind the waterfront buildings and into a mix of modern and historic buildings, including many former warehouses, which today have been adapted into bars, restaurants and nightclubs. From the centre of Stavanger, it's a short ride on the bus out to perhaps the most consequential fjord in all of Norway, the Hafrsfjord. Today, this is a peaceful, if you ignore the fact that Stavanger Airport is at the foot of the fjord, and beautiful stretch of water with a pleasant just under 5 kilometre walk that takes you around the water's edge from Madla Sandnes to the remains of an Iron Age grave. The 9 kilometre long fjord has an entrance directly from the North Sea, and close to here is its narrowest point at around 225 metres wide. From there, the fjord runs mostly north-south, expanding out at Madla Sandnes to a point where it's nearly 5 kilometres at its widest point. The inner part of the fjord is also the deepest, but given it only gets down to 60 metres, it's not going to win any awards for the deepest fjord in the country. Dotted along the coast are lots of small beaches. Slightly further along is the main reason this pleasant walk exists, with the Håhammaren Bridge, a curving bridge that juts out from the rocks to bypass a small cliff that previously split the path in two and required either a long inland detour or climbing up and over the cliff. The bridge opened in 2016, completing the path running around the full length of the Stavanger side of the fjord. The path occasionally steps a few metres back from the water's edge as it passes a number of small harbours and mooring points along the coastline of the fjord. Before reaching the northeastern corner of the fjord at Madla Beach, which has a statue dedicated for fishermen's wives and the important role they played in the primary industries of the city. From here, you also get the first view of the sculpture Sverd i Fjell, or Swords in the Rock. This was created in 1983 as a monument for the Battle of Hafrsfjord. Taking place in some point between 872 and 900, but for celebrating purposes the year 872 has been settled upon by Norway as a founding date of the nation, the battle pitted Harald Fairhair, who had styled himself as the first king of Norway, against fellow Viking kings Erik of Hordaland and Kjotfredrich from the southwestern parts of Norway. His crushing defeat of the other kings of the battle paved the way for Harald to consolidate his power, subdue the country, and collect taxes from a large portion of it. The monument is made up of 3 gigantic bronze swords set into the rocks of the shore of the fjord. The tallest of the swords, at around 10 metres high, represents Harald, with the 2 slightly smaller swords representing his defeated foes. Along with commemorating the battle, the monument is also a representation of peace, since the swords are planted into solid rock so they may never be removed. The monument was designed by sculptor Fritz Røhr and was unveiled by King Olaf V in 1983, the 1111th anniversary of the battle. Continuing on around the fjord from Sverd i Fjell, the path now turns to the southeast, and at this point, walking along the edge of the fjord, you're looking across the widest part of the water. Due to the side of the fjord, it contains a number of small islands, which are visible from the coast here. The path around the coast of the fjord comes to an end at the Grannesbukta Nature Reserve, which is located around and beyond the remains of a former Iron Age burial mound, which can just about be made out in the overgrowth. The nature reserve was created in 1996 to preserve a marine wetland area. From the rear of the burial mound, there are views out across the nature reserve and the fjord. With my time in Stavanger at an end, it's time to take the final leg of a journey down to the southern tip of Norway and the city of Kristiansand. And in a change to all the previous legs of this journey, this time I'm letting the train take the strain as I travel along the Sørlandet line. This 545km long railway line runs from Stavanger to Oslo, though I'm only taking it for the 233km to Kristiansand. With only the evening in Kristiansand, I head south from the city centre, which I'd explored when I was here in 2023, to the island of Odderøya. directly to the south of the city centre and connected it by 4 different bridges. This 0.7 square kilometre island creates a natural division between the eastern and western parts of the port of Kristiansand, with, today, the western port home to the ferries to Denmark and cargo, and the eastern port home to the yachts and pleasure craft. Today, the island is a popular location to go walking and hiking, with many trails around and across the island, lots of them leading to panoramic viewpoints over the city or surrounding waters. But it's not always been that way. Due to the importance of the island overlooking the harbour, there was some form of military presence on the island from at least 1667 until 1999, with the island often closed to civilians. The island held the lazaretto, or quarantine station, the largest in northern Europe, from 1804 to 1914. When it opened, it was the sole quarantine station for the whole of Denmark, Norway and Holstein. The island, naturally, was an important fortification point for the Nazis following their invasion of the previously neutral Norway in April 1940, and from that point until the 23rd of June 1992, the island was off limits to the public. Due to the importance of protecting the harbour, there had been fortifications on the top of Odderøya since the 17th century, but the arrival of the Nazis saw those fortifications modernised, expanded, and built into the Atlantic wall that's followed me all the way down the coast. After the capitulation and surrender of the Nazis in 1945, the fortifications passed into the control of the Norwegian armed forces, with the Coastal Artillery Shooting School moving from Oslo to Odderøya in 1953 and headquartered here until 1997. The fort had a standing emergency force always on standby up until 1959, at which point they were only manned during rehearsal exercises. In its latter years, the fort was used more for boot camp and training purposes, being home to the conscription administration for southern Norway for a number of years. With the armed forces moved out and the island handed back to the city, the fortifications have slowly started to be consumed by nature, but you can still wander around most of the gun emplacements and bunkers on the island, with only a small number in such a poor state of repair they've had to be fenced off, as they're close to collapse. A short walk on from the main fortifications on the top of the island and down a pretty steep path, you reach the Odderøya Fort, or Odderøya Lighthouse, which protects the entrance to the western harbour. The modern automatic light was installed and put into operation in 1984, replacing the 1874 built lighthouse with cottage that still stands next to it. The lighthouse also marks not just the end of the island, but the end of my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand.